I'm the winemaker for Tractorless Vineyard. Tractorless Vineyard is a boutique winery. We're based about an hour and a half south of Sydney in a region called the Southern Highlands. So the main town here is called Barrel. We run our vineyard all biodynamically. We run sheep through the vineyard for the entire growing season, which means we use the tractor about 60% less. And so that's where our name comes from. So, we're trying to be quite a sustainable label. We do a few things like we use these special low carbon glass bottles. So they're about half the carbon of a normal glass bottle. They're a little bit lighter as well. So they do also help us to keep the carbon lower with our shipping. We do the biodynamics, of course, which is very big on our sustainability. We've got solar on the winery. Ultimately, I have this goal of taking the entire winery off the grid one day. At the moment, some of our, battery technology is not quite up to scratch to handle our energy use overnight. But there's some, we're doing some work with some geothermal people, and there's this really cool new company in Australia that's actually taking bio-waste and converting it into electricity, which is pretty cool. So hopefully some of these new technologies will be able to get off the grid eventually one day. But let's taste some wines, because that's why we're here. So we're going to kick off with our Black Sheep Sauvignon Blanc. And we're pretty much going to work our way down that list until we get to the end. And a couple of things I didn't mention before, those bottles are 50 ml bottles. So there is enough in a bottle for 2 people to taste. If you are by yourself, I suggest doing half the bottle with me and saving the other half for afterwards, because you just might struggle to keep up with the tasting if you do the whole bottle yourself. And no, that's not a challenge. The other thing is I do talk about every wine a little bit. Just because I mention the next wine and we sort of start moving on to the next wine, you don't have to panic. There's usually plenty of time for you to finish the wine you're on and move on at your own speed. So you don't have to, when I run our private sessions, I see like 20 people madly trying to scull their wine. So you don't have to worry about that. So Sauvignon Blanc, we're going to do double tasting because there's a few people that have the Fumé block as well. I'll start with the Black Sheep. The Black Sheep is actually a label that was born only in the last few weeks. It's a result of the bushfires this year. I'm sure you're all very well aware of all the terrible fires we had across Australia in January. And as a result, a lot of Australian grapes got what we call smoke taint. And smoke taint is this terrible thing because probably 3 years ago, we couldn't test for it. So you'd pick a grape and a grape would taste great, and you'd make it into wine, the wine would taste great, and you'd put it in a bottle and it tasted great. And then 6 months in bottle and it would taste like an ashtray and it was undrinkable. So it's absolutely devastating because, you not only have you spent all that money ripening the fruit, but then you've spent it making the wine and bottling it before you find out it's unsellable. One of the great things in the last couple of years is Australia's come up with technology to actually analyse the grapes and let us know as winemakers whether we're going to have smoke taint or not. And so this year, as terrible as it sounds that we've lost so much fruit this year, it's actually been a massive lifesaver for a lot of wineries and winemakers that we can actually test these fruit. So our entire region was wiped out. And so Sauv Blanc and our Rosé are the first 2 of our wines that we actually ran out of. And I put a call out, and this is one of the great things about the wine industry. It's actually quite a small wine industry. It's an industry where everyone seems to know everyone, and we seem to everyone seems really friendly and really wants to help each other. So I put a call out to some old uni friends, some just friends I've met in the industry, just saying, guys, you know what, we're one of the many, many people that lost all their fruit. Do you have any extra fruit or wine that we can buy? And let me know, send me some samples. And the response was fantastic. And so I got all these great samples sent to me, and I put together a blend that I think is a good representation of our region, of the same characters we get in our region. And I call this the Black Sheep blend. Now, I'm going to always do these wines now because I have had so much fun making this wine. It has been a really good excuse for me to catch up with all these old friends from the wine industry. And if I do it in future years, which I am planning to, I think what I'm going to do, instead of getting them to send all the samples to me, I'm going to get in the car and actually go do a bit of a road trip and get to visit everyone in their wineries and taste everyone's wine in their wineries. We might even do a bit of a Zoom and YouTube, I don't know, filming of the whole thing, because it's been really fun for me to catch up with some of my old friends and to put together this blend. So I put together this Sauv Blanc blend. It is made to represent the cool climate that we have here in the Southern Highlands. So, you know, everyone thinks, oh, Southern Highlands, it's up there near Sydney, must be fairly warm. Well, our lowest vineyard is 500 metres. So actually quite a cold region. And as such, you know, things like Sauv Blanc, Grigio, Gris, Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Noir, those varieties are what really suit this region. And one of the things with cool climate Sauv Blanc is you always get that quite intense, passion fruity, tropical characters in the wine. And so I really sort of wanted to make our Sauv Blanc, our Black Sheep Sauv Blanc, with those sort of characters in there, which you definitely get those tropical passion fruit characters coming through in that wine. The other thing is that our normal Sauv Blanc, which is the Fumé, which some of you have, I make this in a Bordeaux style, which we call a Fumé style, which is essentially a Sauvignon Blanc that's fermented in oak. And that really mellows out those flavors and makes it more of a sort of a chilled out, mellowed textural style of wine. The Black Sheep, because of the year we've had, it's just been one of those years, hasn't it? You know, I don't even need to tell everyone how terrible the year's been, but because it's been one of those years, I wanted to make the Black Sheep Sauv Blanc in a more sort of fun, springtime, fruity, just like lively style of wine. So I've made the Black Sheep in a more traditional, I put the blend together, I guess, in a more traditional, I guess, fruit-driven Sauv Blanc that we see a lot of coming from New Zealand. And I think that's a bit more fun. And that's why I've made the Black Sheep in that style. If you don't have the Black Sheep and you've got our Fumé Blanc, basically, if you think about a Sauv Blanc and you've got all those intense sort of passion fruity and tropical characters, when you make a Fumé Blanc and ferment it in oak, all you're doing is taking those characters and just mellowing them out a little bit. And then the oak gives us this beautiful bit of texture on the finish. So just as those tropical passion fruit flavors are disappearing, you just get this texture. And I'm a huge fan of texture. You'll notice as we go through our wines, you know, I love to be able to smell our wines. I love to be able to taste our wines. But I also love to be able to feel them in the mouth. And that's one of the things that this Fumé style does. Both the Fumé style and the Black Sheep, you can both see that really traditional passion fruity tropical character in the wines. They're both a good example of how cold we are here. They're just in very different styles. And, you know, it's a shame that I've run out of the Fumé before we could release the Black Sheep, because it would have been actually really a lot of fun to be able to taste them side by side, like we're going to do with the next couple of wines, because it's a really good example of what the winemaker in these different styles. If you happen to have some cheese in front of you, both these Sauv Blancs go beautifully well with an Edam or Jarlsberg or one of those sort of more sort of softer rind cheeses. They're a great match with these Sauv Blancs. I think they're a good example of how cold we are in the Highlands. I love them both, actually. You know, originally I usually not a massive fruity Sauv Blanc drinker. But after experiencing all the different flavors that were coming into the winery with all these samples and putting together this Black Sheep, I actually am really enjoying this Sauv Blanc that we put together. And one of the best things about these virtual tastings is I do get to have a glass or two with you, which I normally don't get to do in the cellar door. So that's our Sauv Blanc. Our region is very well known for Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio. I always get people coming into our cellar door asking me, what is the difference between Pinot Gris and Grigio? And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to make the difference. And so the next wine we're going to taste is our Pinot Grigio. And then we're going to move on to our Pinot Gris. So Pinot Gris and Pinot Grigio are both made from the exact same grape variety. They're both made from the Pinot Gris grape variety. Grigio is the Italian way of doing it, and Gris is the French way of doing it. So just to confuse us all a little bit there, Pinot Gris is the name of the variety, but is also the name of the French style of making that variety. So I think they just like to confuse us all a bit. The first big difference we actually see between the two is the philosophy behind the winemaking. The Italians, to an extent, we can say an Italian winemaker is making a wine specifically for a food. It's not 100% true, but they are definitely very conscious of food when they're making wine. The French, on the other hand, the wine is all about the wine. It doesn't mean that they match any less with food, because they do match beautifully with food. It just means that they're approaching the winemaking from these two really different ends of the spectrum. And so we end up with these quite different styles. If you think about Italy, it's a bit warmer down there, a lot of maritime climate, a lot of seafood. So the Italians are trying to create something that's fresh and zippy and crisp and steely. And so the first thing we do with the Pinot Grigio is we harvest it nice and early, because as we ripen a grape, our sugar levels are increasing and our acid levels are decreasing. And so if we were trying to create a wine that's a lot fresher and zippier and crisper, we want to harvest it nice and early when that natural acid is quite high. So a traditional Grigio is normally around about that 11 to 12% alcohol. And we talk about Beaumet levels in a vineyard, which is basically a sugar level. So there's a million different ways to measure sugar, like Beaumets and Brixes and grams per litre and Oeschlers and specific gravities. A lot of winemakers will use Beaumet, because if I take 1 Beaumet of sugar and ferment it with yeast, I end up with 1% alcohol. So it's just an easy 1-for-1 ratio changeover. So Grigio is normally around about that 11 to 12 Beaumet, which turns into 11 to 12% alcohol. This is one of the first big things. The next thing is that the Italian winemaker, not afraid of oxygen at all. So when I make this wine, I actually squeeze off all the juice into a tank. And then I fill a bucket from the bottom of the tank and I tip it in the top, and I fill it from the bottom and I tip it in the top. And I might do that 10, 20 times until all that juice goes brown from the oxygen. And then I do a really long, slow, cold ferment. And that oxygen and that cold ferment, it helps me stabilize some of the aroma compounds. It helps me give you that crispness and a little bit of those green apple characters. But one of the main things that that cold oxygenated ferment helps with is it helps me create that steeliness on the palate. And this is a really traditional Grigio, Italian Grigio, I guess, feel or character, is this steeliness. And what I mean by steeliness, well, have a look around your house, find a bit of stainless steel and give it a lick. And that's what I mean. I know it's not the best time at the moment with COVID to be licking surfaces, so make sure you clean it first. But that character is what I'm talking about. It's kind of like it's a metallic-y feel on your tongue, but it's not a dirty or irony metallic-y feel. It's quite a clean, crisp metallic-y feel. And that's what we're trying to recreate in a traditional Italian style Grigio, is that sort of crisp, fresh metallic-y steel. And you definitely get that cleanness and crispness on the palate. And we call it steeliness. Now, one of the difficult things with Grigio, and I actually find it the same with a lot of Italian varieties or styles, is they're really hard to taste in a wine tasting scenario. Because of the way we make them, they get all these hidden flavors in there. And so, you know, when you taste this wine now, I'm sort of getting apples and pears and a little bit of stone fruit character in there as well. All nice, fresh, fruity characters. I don't really see any cheesiness or yeasty characters or biscuity characters or any of those sort of more savory characters in this wine. But one of my favorite matches with the Pinot Grigio is a fresh oyster. And when you match it with fresh oysters, all of a sudden you get these beautiful, cheesy lanolin characters coming out of that wine. You think, where did that come from? Because I taste it now and I don't get those flavors at all. But then I taste it with an oyster and I'm getting all these beautiful, cheesy lanolin characters. And it's a great example of what these Italian styles do. They have all these hidden flavors and they need a different food or a change in temperature to release those flavors into your mouth. And it makes them really hard to taste in a wine tasting scenario because all we see now is that 1 second of what this wine has to offer as it's in our mouth. We don't get to see everything it has to offer. We're just seeing, I guess, that snapshot, which makes it quite difficult to taste them in a scenario, especially so without food at all. But even with food, without time to change, like every food has a different flavor. If you were to take that and sit on your desk for the rest of the afternoon or your table for the rest of the afternoon, try it at different temperatures, try it with different foods, you will actually find that the flavor profile of that wine really changes a lot. And every time you look at it, you're like, oh, that's a new flavor. Oh, and there's another one. Oh, and another one and another one. And that's what these flavors, these styles are really continually doing, is showing you all this flavor, and they're continually developing a bit. What we might do is duck over to the Pinot Gris, because it does make it a little bit easier for me to explain these, I guess, hidden flavors if we have something to compare it to. So that's Grigio. Grigio is the Italian way of doing it. They harvest it nice and early, so 11, 12% alcohol. They use a lot of oxygen in their ferment, and it's quite a cold ferment. So we're fermenting sort of that 12 to 15 degrees normally, so quite a cool ferment. And the idea is we're crisp, zippy, fresh style of wine. So it's Grigio, Italian. If we think about Pinot Gris, and not just the variety, but also the style from France, most of the Pinot Gris grapes in France are grown in Alsace, which is on the French-German border. So it's a much colder region. The French, the wine is all about the wine. And so the French are trying to create something that's big and round and voluptuous and viscous. And so one of the first things the French do is they let it ripen a lot more, because they're trying to get that warmth in the mouth from the alcohol, and they're trying to get bigger, fleshier flavors. They usually leave the grapes on the vine for another 4 weeks. And so the alcohol is around about that 13 to 14%, so 13 to 14 Beaumet. So it's about 4 weeks difference. As a result, the first thing you notice, and you'll probably see it a lot better in your glass than mine, is that color difference. It's got a real sort of bronzy color to it. And sometimes you even get a little bit of a pinky tinge. And that's because of the ripeness level. So a Pinot Gris grape is really interesting grape variety. It's one of the only white grape varieties in the world that when it gets super ripe, actually starts turning red. So when a Pinot Gris gets to that sort of high 12s, early 13s, the skins on the berries start turning pink. And it's actually where the name comes from, because if you have all these little pink berries and they're on a bunch, and then that bunch is hanging out in the vineyard, from a distance, they get a light little bit dusting on the outside of the grape bunches, and from a distance, they actually look grey. And the French word for grey is gris. So Pinot, because it's related to Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, and Gris, because the bunches look grey on the grapevines. Now, the Italians, they don't get that colour development. So a Grigio wine, a traditional Grigio wine, always has that sort of greeny white wine colour. Gris, on the other hand, because we're letting it ripen a lot more, we always get that colour development. So traditional French style Gris will always have that sort of bronzy colour. Now in Australia, particularly from our warmer climate regions, that we get a bit more colour development. So quite often you see a pink Gris. So I'm sure if any of you guys drink a lot of Gree, you at some stage in your Gree drinking career have purchased and drunk a pink Gree, and that's why, because you get a bit more color development when you get to that higher alcohol, and also because it's a warmer climate. So that's the first big difference we see. The next thing you see, you can't really see it on my glass, and you look really carefully at your own glass, you'll see sort of up here is a rim of clear liquid, and that clear liquid is dribbling back down into the wine, and we call that the legs of the wine. And what it is everything volatile, so everything in that wine that can evaporate out at room temperature, it evaporates out, it condensates on the glass around here, and it dribbles back down into the wine. Now, this is predominantly alcohol. So the reason we don't see this as much in the Grigio is because the alcohol is only 11, 12%, but in the Gree, 13 to 14%. So we always see these legs on the Gree. And this does something really interesting to the wine. If you give your glass a good swirl and then a good smell, you'll probably agree with me that that wine appears to be a lot more aromatic. There seems to be a lot of fruity aroma jumping out of that glass. The interesting thing is, if I was to scientifically analyze the aroma compounds of the Grigio and the aroma compounds of the Grigio's actually got loads more. And what's happening is, as the alcohol is evaporating out of that Gree, it's grabbing onto all the other flavor components at the same time and pulling it out of that wine as well. And so when we smell it, we're getting hit with all the aroma compounds all at once. If you were to take that Gree and sit it on the table and taste it with different foods and taste it with different temperatures, it really wouldn't change that much. What you see is what you get. And this is one of the biggest differences between Grigios and Grees. A Gree is all, hey, look at me, this is everything I have to offer. And it's showing you all its flavors all at once. Whereas a Grigio is a bit shy, it's showing you a couple of flavors and then showing you another couple of flavors at a different temperature and showing you another couple of flavors at different food. And it's one of the biggest differences. And if you think about how, you know, the Italians, how they eat their food, you know, they start with the antipasto and then they move on to the first and the secondi. And, you know, it's a very long grazing period with a lot of different food types. So you can imagine a wine like that Grigio that is consistently changing with the food actually matches the way they eat. And so it's one of the biggest differences is the way these flavors show each other. And the reason for this is because we're not actually tasting these flavors. We're actually smelling them. So our tongue only has the ability to taste sweetness, sourness, bitterness, saltiness, and umami, which is MSG. So when we taste a wine or eat a peach or, you know, anything like that, when we think we're tasting it, what's happening is we're actually chewing it. And as we chew it and swallow it, some of the aroma compounds of a peach, for example, become airborne and we detect it in the nasal passage. Do you remember as a kid when you had to eat something you didn't want to taste and you used to block your nose? And what we're doing is we're stopping the airflow flow through the nasal passage, so we're not being able to smell those flavors. So for us to be able to, in inverted commas, taste a flavor, that flavor needs to be airborne. In the case of the Pinot Gris, everything is being made airborne all at once by that alcohol. So when we smell it and taste it, we're getting all the characters at once. In the case of the Grigio, because of the way we've made that wine and because of the lower alcohol, a lot of those aromatic compounds are still bound up in the wine. And so we need a change in temperature or a change in chemical composition of that wine to release those flavors. And that's why if I match it with an oyster is changing the chemical composition of the Grigio, which is causing the Grigio to release into the air those yeasty, sort of cheesy characters. And so that's how that works. And then the final thing you notice when you taste that Gris, it's big, it's round, it's voluptuous, And one of the key things with Pinot Gris is it's got this kind of like an oiliness to it, like an oily viscosity. And that oily viscosity is what we call a glycerol. And if I take a grape and I ferment it at a really warm temperature, so I'm talking for a white wine that might be 18 to 22 degrees, it creates what we call glycerols, and glycerols give you that beautiful oily mouthfeel. And this is one of the balancing acts we're always playing as a winemaker. Nice cold ferments give us lots of aromatic compounds, but not much mouthfeel. Nice warm ferments give us a lot of mouthfeel, but not much aromatic compounds. And so, or not many aromatic compounds. And so we're always playing this balancing act between aromatics and mouthfeel, and aromatics and mouthfeel. Now, with Grigios and Gris, it's easy. We pretty much just made two different styles. We've got the Italian style, harvested early, fermented cold, lots of oxygen, and that means we've got higher aromatic compounds but lower mouthfeel, so we've got a more crisp, zippy style aromatic wine. And then we've got the Gris, where we harvest it late. We do a lot warmer ferment. No oxygen at all is allowed near this wine at all, because we're already losing a lot of aromatics because of the warm ferment. So we don't want to lose more with the oxygen. And so we end up with this more mouth-feely, round, robust style, but lower aromatics. And so we've got these two very different styles. Now, these two wines are from the exact same vineyard. They're from the exact same block. And the only difference is about 4 weeks harvest date and the way we make the wine. And it's a really good example of how the winemaker and the viticulturist can actually influence the final style of wine. So that's our Pinot Gris and Grigio. I can put a poll up. I always forget that I can do these cool polls. I can launch a poll and see who likes what. But normally I find that we get about half the people liking Grigio and half the people liking Gris. And in the cellar door, it's pretty much guaranteed that when I get a couple in, one of them will like a Gris, one of them will like a Grigio, which is fine by me because it usually means I sell them 2 bottles instead of 1. So I'm more than happy for them to disagree. And look at that, we've pretty much got split right down the middle today. I love these polls, they're cool. So half and half. What about Chardonnays? Do we have many Chardonnay drinkers on today? Because this is another question I love asking. I can almost preempt the answer, but on average, I get probably about 20 to 30% of people saying yes, and about 80% of people saying no. And today, 25% yes, 75% no. And the funny thing is that the biggest selling white variety in Australia and the biggest selling white variety in the cellar door is Chardonnay. And so those 20% of people, you must do a lot of drinking. So because our sales are so good because of those 20%. Maybe in that 80% that say no, maybe we've got a lot of closet Chardonnay drinkers. Maybe Kath and Kim scared everyone away from admitting that we drinking Chardonnay. I actually think it's to do with the history of Chardonnay. You know, we went from the 70s and 80s where we had these super oaky, super buttery styles. And then we went to sort of late 90s, early 2000s where we had these unoaked fruity styles. And I think everyone has a memory of something that's, you know, too oaky, too fruity, too buttery, not oaky enough, not fruity enough, not buttery enough. We're all a bit unsure about Chardonnay. For me personally, Chardonnay is all about balance. So I want to see a bit of oak. I want to see a bit of butteriness. I want to see a bit of fruit, but I don't want any one of those flavors to sort of overpower the other flavors. I want them all working in a nice harmony. And I am on a massive mission. My mission is to make Chardonnay cool again, because I don't need to convert people to being a Chardonnay drinker because our sales are so great with Chardonnay. But what I think is a shame, I actually think that Australia as a whole are making some of the best Chardonnays we've ever made. You know, down in Victoria, you've got Yarra Valley punching out some great Chardonnays. You've got Mornington, you've got Geelong. Up here in New South Wales, we've got our region, Southern Highlands, you've got Orange, you've got Tumbarumba, all putting out these beautiful balanced style Chardonnays. And for me, the shame is that a lot of people aren't really talking about them. And they're not getting the kudos, I guess, that they deserve. because there's all these other cool varieties around, I guess, that we're talking about. So it is my secret aim. Well, it's not that secret because I tell everyone, every single Zoom meeting I do, I tell everyone the same thing. So it's not a secret aim. It is one of my aims to make Chardonnay cool again, so that we can talk about these great styles. And when you taste this Chardonnay, you go through that journey. You know, it starts off with that nice little bit of oak. I don't ever use first year of oak. I find the first year in an oak barrel is really splintery and overpowering. So I always use 1, 2, 3, and 4-year-old oak. You then get a nice little lick of butteriness before it sort of goes into mangoes and grapefruits and citrus. But the key for me is it's sort of going oaky, buttery, mango, grapefruit, citrus. It's not going like oaky and then buttery and then mango-y and grapefruity. It's, to me, what I'm looking for is that consistency of all those flavors. And, you know, I love a really oaky Chardonnay as long as the buttery notes and the fruity notes match that level of the oak. And that's what I'm looking for when I'm looking at a Chardonnay, is that I guess that balance between all those flavors. I think this is a good example of those styles that we're starting to see more and more of. You know, I'm like a lot of winemakers. I've been making wine now 24 years, and I've made super oaky Chardonnays. I've made super buttery Chardonnays, and I've made super fruity Chardonnays. And I'm now really getting to understand not only how those Chardonnays work and all those flavors work, but how they age in a bottle over time and how they react in a bottle over time. And so I'm really honing down my skills of Chardonnay. And I think a lot of winemakers are doing the same. And that's why we're starting to see more and more great examples of Chardonnay popping up around Australia. And as I said, I think it's a shame we don't talk about them quite as much. But I think that's a good example. I forgot to mention, I usually do food matches. So with the Chardonnay, absolutely love a brie with this. I just love that it doesn't matter the creaminess level of your brie. The buttery and oaky notes of the Chardonnay always come and match it. So if you've got a super creamy fromage dauphinois, those buttery oaky notes will come right up here. And if it's only a little bit creamy, it'll only come to here. And I just think it's cool that no matter where it is, it matches. For the Gris and Grigios, for cheeses, I love like a Manchego or hard rind cheese with the Grigio. With the Gris, I actually don't drink it much with cheese. I always end up drinking it with sashimi and wasabi. For some reason, wasabi and the Gris just work really beautifully together. The Gris sort of takes the edge off the wasabi a bit. Actually, Grigios and Gris are my go-to for spicy food. So if I'm having something like Thai or Vietnamese or something fresh and spicy, I'll go Grigio. If I'm having something a bit more creamy and spicy, like a Indian or something, then I'll often go the Gris. So they're definitely my go-to for those sort of spicy foods, and they seem to be able to handle spice a lot better than a lot of other wines. So next one we're going to taste is our semi-dry Riesling. And I actually do two Rieslings. I do a dry Riesling and a semi-dry. I was tossing up which one to include in the tasting, and I thought, you know, we get to see so many great examples of dry Rieslings all around Australia. And what we don't get to see quite as often are these beautiful examples of that more German style, sweeter style of Riesling. And so that's why I wanted to send this Riesling off with our virtual tasting, because I think it's a good example of those sweeter styles. I think part of the problem in general is that most sweet wines in Australia are made by bigger companies. And I find that if I'm consulting to a big company, because I still do a lot of consulting, and we're fermenting, say, a 20,000 litre batch, and the ferment in 20,000 litres is so strong, you just can't stop it. It's like me standing there in front of a semi-trailer like this. It's just unstoppable. And so what we do is we ferment them dry, and then we back out as sweetness. And when we're back adding as sweetness, we end up with a more like sugary, caramelized character to the wine. If we're making a sweet wine in a more traditional European/German style, we can only do smaller batches. So we can only ferment, say, 3,000 to 5,000 litres at any one time. We start those ferments going, and when the sweetness level is where we want it, we chill it and filter it and stop that ferment. And so what we're doing is we're retaining the natural sweetness of that grape. And what that natural sweetness has is it gives you a much more sort of lush, juicy sweetness rather than a caramelized sweetness. And that's because of the types of sugars and types of acids that are in there. It's very similar to an apple. When you bite into an apple is really fresh and crisp, but an apple actually has quite a high level of sweetness. But because of the types of sugars and the different percentages of those types of sugars and the types of acids and the different percentages of those types of acids and the way they interact, it creates this really fresh, juicy character in an apple. It's exactly the same in grapes. If you can maintain that natural sort of sugar and the types of sugars and acids, you end up with a more juicy, lush style. And that's what we see in this Riesling. I'm not a massive sweet wine drinker, but I can have a glass of that and I think, oh, actually, you know what? That wasn't too bad. I can have another one that don't have no one. You don't have that sort of hanging around caramelized character of the sweetness. It's just always quite fresh. I think in Australia, we taste a sweet wine and we're so quick to put it to dessert, put it to a cheese at the end of a meal. But for me, on a really nice warm day, nicely chilled, this is a great aperitif. Match it with some antipasta, match it with a nice Waldorf salad or something like that. I think that is a great way to start a meal rather than to finish a meal off with. And so that's why I wanted to include this. And, this Riesling is quite a sweet Riesling. It's right up there in the sweetness levels, but I deliberately made it this way because I wanted to demonstrate how something that's quite sweet can actually still be quite fresh and juicy if you use those techniques. And so that's why I made this wine. And it's why I included it in the tasting today. So guys, that's all our white wines for today. I've only just started white wines again. It's starting to warm up here a bit and I've been very excited. It's not often you see me in t-shirt because of the cold weather here. And so I'm really excited to be drinking white wines again. Over the last couple of months, well, it was snowing about a month ago, so it's been freezing cold. I've had the fire absolutely stoked and I'm usually sitting in front of the fire with a bottle of red. And so the first red we're going to taste today is called the Lost Flock. And the Lost Flock, when I came up with the concept of this wine, I was actually sitting in front of the fire and I was drinking a big Barossa red. And I love those reds. They sort of got that velvety tannin, those chocolate notes and those nice raspberry notes. I just find that sometimes they're a little bit heavy. You can have a glass or two and they're a little bit over the top. And so I wanted to make a blend up that had similar characters, that had that same sort of velvety tannin and chocolates and raspberries, but was a lot more delicate. And so that I could sit back and drink the bottle of it in front of the fire. Not that I'm telling anyone to drink a bottle by themselves, but it may have been a little bit of inspiration behind this wine. And so I came up with this blend. We call it the Lost Flock. It's a wine that I guess I drink a lot of, mainly a little bit by default because, do you remember back in the days when we were allowed to have dinner parties? Well, back in those days, I always took the Lost Flock because, someone likes Shiraz, someone likes Merlot, someone likes Grenache. If you take a blend, everyone can find a flavour that they like. And so I usually default to blends when I'm going out to dinner or to a barbecue or something like that. That's a wine that I do drink a lot of. It's a wine that's quite special to us, but mainly because of its name, the Lost Flock. So when you choose to become biodynamic organic, you're doing it from a really philosophical point of view, because if I was to make a Shiraz, for example, and put it in the marketplace, it might be valued at, say, $30. If I make a biodynamic or organic Shiraz and put it in the marketplace, it's still really only valued at $30. So I don't get any increase in value for being biodynamic or organic. It's starting to change a little bit, but at the moment it's about the same. The problem with running the vineyard biodynamically is it's really expensive way to grow the grapes. And our biggest expense is actually managing the grass. So with industrial vineyard, it's easy. We just herbicide all the grass, Well, we herbicide strips underneath the grapevines. And so all we have to do is mow that middle section. So it's quite easy to manage the grass. With biodynamics or organics, we don't want to use a herbicide. So we spend a lot of time mulching and cultivating and whippersnipping, and grass management becomes a big expense in the vineyard. And especially our region, we're quite a fertile region, so we get a lot of grass growth, so it is a very expensive part of the vineyard. In 2013, that's right, yeah, 2013, we had a caterpillar problem in the vineyard. And the biodynamic philosophy says that if you have insect problems on your land, it's because you don't have enough animals. And so we started experimenting with sheep. And first I thought Dorpers. Dorpers will be perfect. They're fairly easy to look after. You know, all their wool sheds, and so you don't have to worry about shearing them. So I thought, yeah, perfect, we'll get Dorpers. So we got these Dorpers. Well, a Dorper is pretty much like a goat, and they ate half the vineyard. So that experiment did not work well at all. I grew up on a sheep farm. I grew up on a merino farm. And merinos are what we call grazing sheep. So a Dorper is a browsing sheep, which means they look everywhere for food, and when they see it, they just eat it. A merino is a grazing sheep. So they only look inside their feeding zone for food, and they don't look outside of their feeding zone until they've eaten all the food in their feeding zone. So the merinos, they kind of worked. You know, the grapevine sat here, which was outside of their feeding zone. The bunches hung down just inside their feeding zone. And what we did is we ran 2 electrical wires under the bunches, and that stopped the sheep from eating the grapes. The problem that year was when the power went out for 2 hours, it's amazing how many grapes a merino can eat in 2 hours. So we lost a lot of grapes that year, but we were getting closer. Eventually we found a rare breed of sheep that we call a Hampshire Down. They're a breed from the UK, and they're a grazing sheep, the same as a Hampshire Down. You can, same as a merino. You can sort of see them in the background of my photo there. One of the biggest differences between a merino and a Hampshire Down is that a Hampshire Down is 2 inches shorter. So with a merino, the grapevine, the bunches are sitting here inside their feeding zone. With a Hampshire Down, they're outside the feeding zone. So what that means is we can run these sheep underneath the vineyard for the entire growing period. Now this has solved our caterpillar problem. And I don't know why I didn't think about it at the time, but I was so obsessed with this caterpillar problem. But guess what? Sheep eat grass. And so now the most expensive part of running our vineyard is done for free by the sheep. So they've really taken something that was a philosophical but expensive choice and converted it into something that is about the same cost as a normal industrial vineyard. So they really have, I guess, changed the cost structure for us quite a lot. But the Hampshire Down is even cooler than that, because a Hampshire Down is what we call a roaming sheep. So a merino and a Dorper is a flocking sheep. So you end up with these sheep camps where all the manure's in one spot, where there's no grass in one spot. They follow each other through the vineyard, so you end up with these tracts of compaction. With a Hampshire Down, you don't have any of those problems. They spread out beautifully all around the vineyard. It's absolutely beautiful for the vineyard. It's a nightmare when I go to shear them, because I always end up with one sheep wandering around the vineyard that misses being shorn. So I always end up with this one woolly sheep. I actually think that's a great name for a wine, the woolly sheep. And I've just got to think of the wine that's going to be called the woolly sheep now. So stay tuned. That's going to be a new release next year, I think, the woolly sheep. But it reminded me, when I make this wine, I stack all the Shiraz barrels in one stack, and all the Merlot barrels in one stack, and all the Grenache barrels in one stack. And those stacks were scattered all over the winery. And it reminded me of the sheep being scattered all over the vineyard. And so that's my very long story on why we call this wine the Lost Flock. But the sheep are super fundamental to us now. You know, the reason they feature on our labels is, you know, because they are so important to our vineyard. The reason that our labels economically sustainable is because of the sheep. The reason that our business is environmentally sustainable is because of the sheep. They're saving us 60% of our tractor use. They enable us to manage the grass in a really regenerative way, which means that we're actually sequestering a lot more carbon into our soils than a normal biodynamic vineyard. So they really are fundamental in our whole sustainability structure. I am a massive believer of regenerative agriculture and the use of animals to save our world. And I could talk about it for the rest of the afternoon, but we're here to taste wine, so I won't. So that's the Lost Flock. I think I forgot to mention, it's a Grenache, Shiraz, Mourvedre with a little bit of Merlot and Petit Verdot. So it's essentially a GSM, but with Merlot and Petit Verdot. It's a wine that is special to us. It's a wine that I do drink a lot of. And I know as a parent, you're not meant to have your favorite child, but the next wine is my secret favorite child. And the next wine is our Reserve Pinot. And our Reserve Pinot, we only make this, say, once every 5 years, when all the conditions are right. Every other year we make what I call a more contemporary style, a style that we're very used to seeing here in Australia. Beautiful, vibrant fruits and these delicate but interesting palates. They always remind me of ballerinas. They're sort of complex and interesting, but at the same time really delicate and lively. And I love those styles. But a style that we don't get to try that often here in Australia are those old school funky Burgundian styles. And so that's how we do our Reserve. Loads of whole bunches, loads of stems. When it first goes into bottle, it's undrinkable. It's bitter and resiny and stemsy, and it actually needs about 3 or 4 years in bottle to really settle down. And if you've been lucky enough to travel through Burgundy and France, you'll know that you can't really buy a Pinot over there that's under about 3 or 4 years old from a cellar door. And that's because they use this technique over there. But what it does is it creates these big, funky sort of style, mushroomy and forest flory and cigar boxy styles of Pinot. Normally we'd match a Pinot with a bit of dark or pheasant or something. I find these more Burgundian funky styles are a great match with venison, or one of my favorite matches here is actually kangaroo. And so I find that it can just handle those sort of redder, more gamey meats. It may notice a little bit of cloudiness in this. This is actually one of our more natural wines. It's all unfiltered. It's vegan. It's old school winemaking. It's one of the wines that we do. This and our Cabernet are 100% designed to age. So this will age and age and age and age and age. I love this style. My accountant hates this style. We spend all this time and money making it, and then I put it into storage for 4 years before we sell it. And I'd love to be able to say that he doesn't get a say in it, but he does get a bit of a say in it, because that's probably one of the reasons we only make it every 5 years or so. But I love that style. It's definitely one to age. Definitely a very different style that we're used to seeing here in Australia. And so I'm glad that we included it in our tasting, because I love it. I mentioned earlier that I love texture in my wines. And to get that texture, I use a lot more, European-based techniques. So pretty much all of our wines, except for the Black Sheep Sauv Blanc, which was a bit of a blend, but all of our wines up until now, I've used those European techniques. And the advantage of those techniques, we get a lot more texture in the wines. The disadvantage of those techniques is you usually find the fruit level is a little bit dull, and they take a lot longer time in bottle. Now that Pinot is this huge, at the extreme end of the spectrum with 4 years, but our Chardonnay and our Grise and things, they need about 18 to 24 months to really settle down their bottle. So there's some of the negative things of those techniques. If I'm making a wine using more Australian contemporary techniques, I end up with a very vibrant, fruity style of wine, not sweet fruity, but vibrant and lifted and lively. A lot of those traditional Australian Pinots that we taste have that beautiful vibrancy about them. And I love that style as well. The next wine we're going to taste, which is our Shiraz, our creator's Shiraz, this is made using those more contemporary Australian techniques. And I had to do a Shiraz because one of the first jobs I ever had when I finished school was with a famous winery called Clonakilla in Canberra. And they're quite famous for their cool climate Shiraz. And so, you know, the Kirks really ingrained Shiraz in my winemaking history. They were probably instrumental in creating my love and passion for wine. They are such friendly, open people that you know, they really fostered that love of wine in me. And so I had to do a Shiraz. I had to do a Shiraz because, you know, Australia's famous for Shiraz. One of the reasons that we're known around the world is for our Shiraz. And so I really wanted to do one, and I wanted to do one in quite a contemporary, you know, it's funny that the words don't match, but a contemporary traditional style. So this is a style that I guess the winemaking techniques we use here in Australia are seen as contemporary because, you know, we're only a couple of 100 years old, but it's traditional for us. So I had to do it in those styles, that style. I love showing this wine in America. You know, we just launched these virtual tastings in America. So please tell your American friends that they can do one of these. You can actually even join them and do a tasting from around the world. It doesn't work so well if your friends are over in New York, because it means that you're getting up about 8 or 9 in the morning to do a wine tasting, but it works a bit better on the other side of the US. But I love showing it over there because if you ask me to pick a style of wine that is sort of represents young winemakers of Australia, this would be what I pick. And I think that this cool climate style of Shiraz is really representative of what we're doing really well in Australia at the moment. And so I had to do one. One of their problems with Shiraz is that in our region, way too cold for Shiraz. We can't really grow Shiraz in the Southern Highlands because it's quite cold. And so I work very closely with some growers in Young, in Hilltops. And so that's where we get our grapes from. And that's why it comes under that Creators label. So you'll notice we've actually got 2 series. We've got our Creators series and we've got our Sustainable series. So the Sustainable series wine, which is the one with the tractor, is 100% off our biodynamic blocks. And the Creators series is not 100% off our biodynamic blocks. So in the case of Shiraz, it's something that I really wanted to make. And so we work with some growers outside of our region. That's why it comes under the Creators label. And we really wanted to define those 2 different series. One of the things I love about these cool climate Shirazes is the structure. And if you taste that wine, you think about where that furriness is and where the acid is. You sort of get right down the middle of the tongue, this line of tannin and this line of acid. And what that does is creates this structure around the wine. If you can imagine a warm climate Shiraz, they have all these complex, intense fruit flavors, and they just sort of go, there you go. And they give it to you all at once. And it's like, whoa, wow, it's amazing, but all at once. These cool climate Shirazes have all this complex, intense fruit flavor, but because of this structure, they just kind of hand you the flavor and hand you the flavor, and they keep handing you the flavor rather than throwing it at you all at once. And that's one of the things that I really love about cool climate Shiraz from Australia. I find that Canberra, Hilltops, Young, which is where we get our fruit from, and Heathcote are the 3 regions that I think consistently give you that structure in the wine. You know, other regions do sometimes don't other times. So that's why we work closely with the young growers, because I think it gives you that consistency. And I just love that style. Actually, it's going to be my new take a wine to dinner party wine, because I'm really loving that Shiraz at the moment. I've been drinking a lot of it. It's a great example of that cool climate style. You know, if you do drink a lot of those cool climate Shirazes, this is pretty much exactly what you'd expect to get. You know, and I've deliberately made it in those styles to really, I guess, showcase what Shiraz in Australia is. Well, cool climate Shiraz in Australia. So we've got 2 more, and these are 2 interesting wines to end on. The first one we're going to look at is called our Post-Mac Cabernet Sauvignon. And when I was at uni, I was really lucky because there was about I think there was about 6 of us at uni doing the winemaking degree when I went through uni. And 2 years after me, there was about 200. So I became a winemaker before it was cool to be a winemaker. And what it meant was I got to try some amazing wines because one of our lecturers, who's a master in wine, is Nick Bulliard. And it meant that he could just grab a bottle from his cellar and the 6 of us could taste it. When there was 200 of us, he couldn't just grab a bottle from the cellar because he had to make sure there was enough for 200 people. So I got to try some amazing wines. And one of the wines that has always stuck into my memory was a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. So the McGill vineyard is one of the original Penfolds vineyard in Australia down in Adelaide. And this wine would have been about 46 years old at the time. And it was just amazing. And ever since that day, I've been obsessed with wanting to make a wine that can age 50 to 100 years. And when we look around the world at who's famous for creating these wines that age 50 to 100 years, well, the region that consistently comes up is Bordeaux. And the people from Bordeaux, the Bordelais, they created this technique that we call post-ferment maceration. And it's what we use in this Cabernet. And what it is a lot of people don't know, but when I'm making a red wine, if I take a grape and I squeeze it, the juice and the pulp inside is actually white. So to create a red wine, I need to extract all that color out of the skins. And what we do is we ferment it with the skins, and that ferment process takes about 3 or 4 weeks. If I then leave that wine sitting with the skins after the ferment's finished, we call it post-ferment maceration. Now in Australia, we play around with 1-2 weeks to 1-2 months. In Bordeaux, they routinely leave it 12 to 18 months. And what it does is it solves 2 problems that we have when we're aging wines. So the first problem we have is a fruit problem. So imagine I've got a wine, and a normal bottle of wine might have a fruit level here. And as I age that bottle of wine, that fruit level's slowly dropping and the savory level's slowly coming up. And the premium drinking is about here when they're about the same, which might be, 10, 15 years. So if I want to make a wine that's going to last 50 to 100 years, I need to start with a huge amount of stable fruit so that when it balances out, it's balancing out up here. So that's one of the first problems I have. The second problem I have is a structural problem. If you can imagine, when you have a young Cabernet, a really young Cabernet, they have that really chalky tannin. It coats the tongue, angular tannins, almost like it feels like chalkiness in there. Those chalky angular tannins are short chains. And as we age a bottle of wine, those short chains join together into a long chain. And a long chain is nice and soft and velvety. So it's one of the good things that are happening as we age a bottle of wine. Imagine I've got a bottle, and in that bottle, I've got 100 short tannins. And as we age that wine, those 100 short tannins join to 50 long tannins, which join to 25 really long tannins as we age it more. So I end up with 25 of these beautiful, velvety, sweet tannins in that wine. Unfortunately, 25 is not enough, and the whole structure of that wine falls apart. And so this process solves both these problems. I've got a tank of wine sitting there, and it's sitting there for 18 months with the skins and seeds and stems. And so I've got thousands and thousands of these short chain tannins floating around that tank, which forces them together into a long chain tannin. So when I bottle this wine, I'm bottling it with 100 long, stable tannins rather than 100 short, unstable tannins. And so that's how this process solves the structural problem of the wine. The fruit problem, I have absolutely no idea how the French figured this out, because at no stage when you're making this does it taste fruity. And I remember at about 3 months coming out to the winery, taking a sample, I smelt it, and I tasted it, and I thought, oh my God, I have completely ruined this wine. It tastes absolutely disgusting. I started calling around some winemaking friends, some mentors in the industry here in Australia. Guys, we tried this technique. You know, what happened? Tell me about it. And they all said the exact same thing. They all said, yeah, we tried it. We got to 3 months. It tasted so terrible. We pressed it off. We put it into oak. But don't worry, Jeff, you'll be able to blend the flavour out. So everyone in Australia is telling me to press it off, put it into oak. Everyone in France is saying, no, just leave it. And so I decided to leave it. And I left it 12 months and it wasn't really that much better. And I left it 18 months and I could feel that those tannins had really become long and velvety and complexed out, but it had no fruit flavour. It tasted like stems and seeds and skins and not fruity at all. And I put it at oak 18 months and I remember bottling this wine. I remember bottling it thinking, am I doing the right thing here? Am I about to end up with pallets of wine that I can't sell because there's no fruit flavour in this? I thought, well, you know, I've already got the bottles, I'm already doing the bottling, I may as well do it. So I bottled it. And then about 12 months later, in the bottle out of nowhere was this explosion of fruit. These really intense cassis, capsicum, tomato leaf, you know, cool climate Cabernet characters. And now I'm actually really excited about this wine because it's doing exactly what the French said it would do. You know, we've got quite you know, it's a 5-year-old Cabernet. It's still very, very fruity. It's got those nice long velvety tannins. So in 50 years' time, we can get back on Zoom and I can tell you whether this experiment worked or not. And it is an experiment. I still to this day have not met anyone in Australia that has made a Cabernet to 18 months on the skins. You know, Wine Australia did a massive research project into post-ferment maceration and it went to 6 months. And the reason is they took it to that 3-month mark, they tasted it, analysed it, went to 4 months, tasted, analysed it, no change. 5 months, no change. 6 months, no change. So they stopped the project. And I can tell you between 3 months and 12 months, nothing happened in this wine. Between 12 and 18, everything happened. And what did the French say? 12 to 18. So I don't know what's happening, but something is definitely happening. But I am very excited about what this wine is going to do over the next few years. You know, I love it at the moment. It's definitely in that more fruity spectrum. So we do get a lot of that cassis capsicum, but I find that is a beautiful match with roast lamb. So I do drink this a lot when I'm having roast lamb. But I'm also really excited to see, you know, I just can't believe that fruit just keeps hanging on and hanging on and hanging on. So I'm really excited to see how this ages over the next 50 to 100 years. You know, I'll probably taste it 100 years and tell my son that, you know, we did it, I did it, I worked out how to do it, now you have to do it. Just as it's like, isn't that like becoming an artist or something? Just as you're about to take your last breath. Anyway, I love that style and I'm very excited about it. So we've got one more to end on. This is a really interesting one to end on. We call it 8,000 vintages. And the oldest record of winemaking in the world comes from a country called Georgia in Eastern Europe. And it's dated 6,000 BC. So that's 3,000 years before Egypt. So there's some serious wine history going on there. And the Georgians make a very famous red style they call Kinsmarali. I'm going to put that up in the notes because it's hard to spell. Kinsmarali. And anyway, I was lucky enough. I spent 7 years consulting in Georgia. I do 6 months Australia, 6 months Georgia for 7 years. And this is my homage to the history of wine and homage to Georgia. It's our Australian version of Kinsmarali. How do I describe it? Because when I taste it, I just think of Kinsmarali. It's kind of got the depth and complexity like and that Christmas character like a tawny port, but then it has that beautiful bright red fruit character like a ruby port or a young red, but it's only got 12% alcohol. So it's not fortified at all. It's made like a normal wine. It's super famous over there. Like I sell heaps and heaps of this to Russians and Eastern Europeans here in Australia because it is a very famous style over there. I think it was 2006 when I went over there and, you know, Russia and Georgia had that little battle and the Russians put an embargo on all imports from Georgia. and it was still our biggest market. We used to smuggle Kinsman Rally across the border in school buses. So it's that famous over there. It's a great style to end on because it is something that's quite unique. It's quite different. We are starting to see some Georgian wines pop up around Australia. So I definitely recommend grabbing them if you see them. It's a great match for like a mature cheddar or a dark chocolate. But one of my favorite matches is actually with, you know, that American style barbecue, that really smoky style barbecue. I reckon that is a great match with this wine. So guys, that's all I've got for you today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope that I didn't bore you with my big long stories of sheep, but they are very important to us. I would love you all to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. These virtual tastings, even as we let the borders down and people can come and visit us and meet our sheep in the winery and the vineyard and do some of our experiences that are up on our website. We're still going to do these because the feedback has been great. You know, the feedback's been that, you know, on a Saturday afternoon, I can sit around with my friends at home. I don't have to worry about designated drivers. I don't have to worry about accommodation and that sort of thing. And I can enjoy some wines and taste some wines. So we're about to launch a museum range of tastings. We're going to do a sparkling range of tastings. We're going to start doing some more demonstrations and those sorts of things and sort of ramp up that visual side of things. All that will go up on our Facebook and Instagram. As I mentioned, we're in America doing these too now, so you can actually join some American friends. They've only got 6 wines, unfortunately, because we've only got 6 wines over there. But they're the exact same wines as here, so we can link up a virtual tasting across the sea. If you do buy something, which of course I'd love you to, please don't get confused. I'll put a link up there. We make good wine, but we have a terrible website, and you'll end up at a bottle shop down the south coast. That is where you're meant to be. We're borrowing their website to process all our orders at the moment. It's called Vincenia Cellars. There you go. I'll put some links up there, and there's also some voucher codes and things in those links. And remember, if you guys after the session today, you want to go live and meet some new wine people, and also I know a lot of you have friends on here that you want to catch up. There's a link further up in the chat that you can log into, and you can actually all go a bit more live with the video. So guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I really do hope you enjoyed it. I hope that when the borders come down, that we might see you up here in the Highlands one day. And stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you really soon. So guys, see you later, and look after yourself. Now, I'll actually stay on live for a little bit longer and leave my, I'll leave my chat on for